They say grief makes people do strange things, but they never warn you about becoming someone's living memorial. 4 years ago, my neighbor lost her daughter in an accident. Yesterday, she screamed in our driveway that I would never measure up to her dead child. The worst part? For a moment, I felt like I'd failed her by refusing to be the ghost she needed me to become. Well, I lived next door to the same family for most of my life. The kind of proximity that creates a comfortable familiarity, where you know each other's routines, share occasional pleasantries, maybe even borrow sugar or eggs in a pinch. They were just the neighbors, the ones with the pretty garden, the ones who'd wave as they collected their morning newspaper. I'd babysit their younger daughter occasionally, help them carry groceries sometimes. Normal neighbor things. Their older daughter was never someone I knew well. 5 years older than me, we existed in different worlds despite the mere 20 feet between our bedroom windows. She was already in high school when I was still playing with dolls. By the time I entered my teens, she was away at college. We were cordial when our paths crossed during holidays, but we weren't friends. We weren't close. Just two people who happened to grow up on the same street, our lives overlapping only in geography. I remember the day everything changed with startling clarity. A Monday in April, spring flowers just beginning to bloom. The ambulance had come and gone in the early morning hours while I slept. The news traveled through the neighborhood in hushed phone calls and solemn doorway conversations. Their daughter, car accident, didn't make it, so young, such a tragedy. When I got home from school, my mother sat me down and explained with gentle words. I remember feeling a strange, hollow sensation. Not quite sadness, not quite fear, but something in between. A sudden awareness of how fragile everything is. One moment someone exists, the next they don't. One moment a mother has a daughter, the next she doesn't. I attended the funeral because that's what neighbors do. I hugged her mother tightly, because that's what humans do when faced with another's unbearable pain. I brought food, I sent cards, I checked in periodically. All the things you're supposed to do when death visits the house next door. I was 16 then, too young to fully understand the complexity of grief, but old enough to recognize the hollow look that had taken residence in her mother's eyes. I wanted to help, in the limited way a teenager could. What I couldn't possibly have understood was that my genuine compassion was opening a door that would become increasingly difficult to close. The first time she commented on the similarity between her daughter and me, I barely registered it. "You laugh just like her," she said during a neighborhood barbecue, several months after the funeral. I smiled politely, unsure how to respond. It seemed harmless enough, a bittersweet observation from a mourning mother. But comments like that continued to accumulate. My hair, my mannerisms, the way I spoke, apparently all reminiscent of her daughter. Each observation made me increasingly uncomfortable. But what teenager knows how to tell a grieving parent that their coping mechanism is inappropriate? So I smiled and nodded, each time feeling the invisible weight of an identity that wasn't mine being gently placed upon my shoulders. By the time I turned 17, the invitations began. Would I like to come over and have tea in the garden? Would I be interested in looking at some old books her daughter had loved? Perhaps I could help plant the memorial garden they were creating? I said yes more often than not. Partly out of politeness, partly out of genuine concern for her well-being, and partly because I lacked the emotional vocabulary to say no. Her husband would sometimes watch these interactions with a furrowed brow, occasionally interjecting when her comments about me ventured too far into uncomfortable territory. "She's not her," he'd say gently when his wife's eyes lingered too long on me. "She's her own amazing person." I'd feel immediate relief at his intervention, followed by the crushing awkwardness of acknowledging what was happening. But those moments would pass, and we'd all pretend everything was normal. I remember one afternoon, particularly clearly. She had invited me over to help plant tulip bulbs, her daughter's favorite flower, she explained. As we worked the soil together, she began telling stories. Not just any stories, but intensely personal ones about her daughter, her childhood fears, her teenage rebellions, her college dreams. With each revelation, I felt increasingly like an intruder in someone else's intimate history. She used to hate thunderstorms, she said, pressing a bulb into the dark earth. Would climb into our bed until she was 12. "You're not afraid of storms, are you?" "No," I answered, uncomfortable with the comparison that seemed to lurk behind every question. "She would have liked that about you," she continued, as if her daughter and I might have been friends in some alternate timeline where we both existed as adults simultaneously. She was trying to be braver about things like that. I nodded, focusing intently on the gardening task at hand, unsure how to navigate this strange terrain where I was simultaneously myself and a ghost's potential companion. Her husband appeared then, offering lemonade and a subtle lifeline of ordinary conversation. I noticed the concerned glance he gave his wife, the slight shake of his head that she either didn't see or chose to ignore. I wondered often about their private conversations, whether he tried to guide her toward healthier grieving, whether she resented his attempts to move forward. That summer grew increasingly strange. She began leaving small gifts on our doorstep, a bookmark, a bracelet, a small potted plant, always with notes that hinted at connections to her daughter. She loved this author too, or this reminded me of something she would have picked for you. The gifts themselves were innocent enough, but the accumulation of them felt overwhelming, as if I were slowly being buried under the weight of someone else's memory. My parents noticed, of course. How could they not? They tried to maintain diplomatic relations with the neighbors, while gently encouraging me to establish boundaries. "You're not responsible for her healing," my mother would remind me. But at 17, the line between compassion and self-preservation was blurry at best. The summer I turned 18, just before leaving for college, things escalated in subtle but meaningful ways. She'd watch me leave my house, asking casual yet probing questions about my destination, my companions, my expected return time. "Just looking out for you," she'd say with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. I started using the back door more frequently. One evening, she caught me retrieving my family's mail and launched into a 30-minute monologue about how her daughter had been accepted to the same university I was attending. She detailed the major her daughter had chosen, the dorm she would have lived in, the career she had planned to pursue. With each detail, I felt less like myself, and more like a canvas onto which she was projecting an alternate reality, one where her daughter had lived to fulfill these plans. "You'll have to tell me all about the psychology department," she said, though I had never mentioned any interest in that field. "That's where she would have spent most of her time." "I'm studying literature," I reminded her gently. Her face fell slightly, as if I had somehow disappointed her. "Well, maybe you could still visit the psychology building. Take a picture for me." I nodded non-committally, feeling the weight of an unspoken expectation settle more firmly onto my shoulders. That night, I told my parents about the interaction. My father sighed heavily, exchanging a concerned look with my mother. "We'll talk to them while you're at school," he promised. "Give everyone some space to reset." I left for college with a mixture of excitement and relief. The physical distance provided a natural buffer. The occasional text message was easy enough to respond to politely, but briefly. Coming home for holidays meant brief, managed interactions. I thought perhaps time was healing, that the inappropriate attachment was fading. I was wrong. When I moved back home, temporarily at 19, after my freshman year, planning to stay for the summer before returning to campus, it was as if her grief had been preserved in amber, waiting for my return to continue exactly where it had left off. My first week back, I found a photo album on our front porch. Inside was a carefully curated collection of pictures, her daughter at various ages, alongside recent photos of me that I recognized from social media. The visual comparison was unmistakable and deeply disturbing. Someone had spent hours finding pictures where our poses, expressions, or outfits echoed each other, creating an unsettling visual narrative of substitution. I returned the album immediately, knocking on their door with determined politeness. Her husband answered, his expression shifting from welcome to concern as he saw what I was holding. "This was on our porch," I explained, keeping my voice steady. "I think it might have been left by mistake." He took the album, glancing at its contents with a grimace of recognition. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'll talk to her. Is she getting any help?" I asked, the question escaping before I could censor myself. "Professional help, I mean." His eyes clouded with a mixture of sadness and frustration. "She was, for a while. She stopped going about 6 months ago. Says she's handling it in her own way." He hesitated, then added, "I know it's not fair to you." "None of this is." I nodded, appreciating his acknowledgement while feeling helpless to change the situation. As I turned to leave, he called after me, "Try not to take it personally. When she looks at you, she's not really seeing you." I know that doesn't make it easier. His words stayed with me, a complicated truth that both absolved me of responsibility and highlighted the impossibility of the situation. How does one exist authentically in the shadow of someone else's grief? Last August, at 20 years old, I was living alone in my parents' house while they traveled abroad. It should have been a period of welcome independence, a quiet summer to myself before returning to the pressures of college life. Instead, it became the summer I could no longer pretend not to see what was happening. She began to monitor my comings and goings with an intensity that felt suffocating. "Where are you headed, sweetie?" she called from her porch. "Who are you meeting? When will you be back?" The questions a mother asks her teenage daughter, not what a neighbor asks an adult woman. I started to feel anxious every time I needed to leave my house, timing my departures to avoid these interrogations. My stomach would knot whenever I heard her screen door open, knowing she might be watching, waiting to intercept me. I began using the back door, slipping through my own yard like a trespasser. I'd wait in my car until I was certain she wasn't outside before getting my mail. The mental energy required to avoid these interactions was exhausting, a constant background process running in my mind. One evening, after politely but firmly telling her that I wasn't comfortable with her questions and reminding her that she wasn't my parent, I thought perhaps I had finally established a necessary boundary. She nodded and apologized, her eyes filling with tears that made me instantly regret my assertion. But for a few blessed weeks, the questioning stopped. But something else replaced it, an increasing physical affection that felt intrusive and unwelcome. Every encounter now ended with her arms around me, holding on just a little too long, a little too tightly. "You're like a daughter to me," she'd murmur into my hair, while I stood rigid in her embrace, unsure how to extricate myself without causing pain. Each time, I'd feel the phantom weight of expectation growing heavier. Then came the night that crossed a line so clearly that even my conflict-avoidant self couldn't ignore it. She was sitting in her garage, music playing softly, a glass of wine in her hand that wasn't her first of the evening. I was returning from a run and stopped briefly to say hello, a neighborly habit I was beginning to regret. "My replacement kid," she said with a smile that was both sad and somehow triumphant. "That's what you are, you know. My beautiful replacement." The words hung in the August air between us, honest in their cruelty, cruel in their honesty. I stood frozen, sweat cooling on my skin, heart pounding from more than just physical exertion. What does one say to that? How does one respond to being explicitly cast as an understudy for the dead? I said nothing. I mumbled something about needing a shower and fled to my house, locking the door behind me as if I could also lock out the reality of what had just transpired. That night, I lay awake wondering if her daughter had ever felt this same pressure, this sense of being molded into someone else's expectation rather than being allowed to exist as herself. The months that followed were an exercise in avoidance. I had developed an acute awareness of her schedule, planning my movements around her absence. I stopped checking her texts immediately, allowing hours or sometimes days to pass before responding with brief, polite messages that discouraged further conversation. I became a ghost in my own neighborhood, slipping between car and house with practiced efficiency. One evening in October, I ran into her husband at the local grocery store. He looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from carrying someone else's grief alongside your own. We exchanged pleasantries in the produce section, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across his face. "I'm sorry about everything," he said finally, after the small talk had run its course. "She's not been herself since—" He trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging between us like a curtain neither of us wanted to pull aside. "I understand," I replied, though I wasn't sure I did, not really. How could I understand the loss of a child? How could I comprehend the desperation that would lead someone to try to replace that child with a neighborhood girl who happened to share a few superficial similarities? "No, you don't," he said, not unkindly. "And I hope you never have to, but I want you to know I'm trying to get her help again. Real help this time." I nodded, relief mingling with guilt at the thought that perhaps this awkward chapter might eventually close. "Thank you. I don't know how to be what she needs me to be." "You're not supposed to be anything but yourself," he said, squeezing my shoulder briefly. "That's on us, not you." That conversation gave me hope that perhaps professional intervention would redirect her grief into healthier channels. I relaxed my vigilance slightly, less anxious about unexpected encounters. Perhaps that's why I was caught off guard by what happened next. But grief is persistent, and those who are drowning will grasp at anything that floats. In December, 4 years after her daughter's death, my phone lit up with a message that finally broke whatever tenuous peace I had been maintaining. It was a rambling text, a stream of consciousness about her younger daughter being hospitalized, about a cat with an ear infection, about the relentless unfairness of life. It read like a diary entry accidentally sent as a text, intimate in a way that made me deeply uncomfortable. The boundaries between appropriate sharing and emotional dumping had not just been crossed, but obliterated. And attached was a photograph, so graphic, so invasive, that I physically recoiled. Her daughter's severely bruised abdomen, purple and yellow, and horrifically intimate. A medical trauma displayed without context or consent, sent to someone who had neither the relationship nor the medical training to receive such an image. I felt violated on behalf of her daughter, whose privacy had been so casually disregarded. I felt violated myself, forced into a false intimacy that I had never consented to. But mostly, I felt angry. A clean, clarifying anger that cut through years of uncomfortable acquiescence. Who sends something like that to their young neighbor? What was I supposed to do with this information, with this image seared into my memory? Was I supposed to rush over, play the role of family member, of confidante, of surrogate daughter? The expectation was as clear as it was inappropriate. I sat with the message for hours, drafting and deleting responses. My first instinct was to be gentle, to cushion the necessary boundary with softness and understanding. But 4 years of gentle deflection had led nowhere. Perhaps clarity required firmness. I responded with what I believed was a clear but compassionate message. I acknowledged her pain but firmly established my boundaries. I pointed out the inappropriateness of trauma dumping on a 20-year-old neighbor. I explicitly stated that I was not her therapist, not her family, and most importantly, not her daughter, or a replacement for her daughter. I wished her healing and a better year ahead, then put down my phone, feeling both liberated and slightly nauseated. The silence that followed was deafening. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. No response, no acknowledgement. When we passed each other in the driveway or at the mailbox, her eyes would slide past me, as if I were invisible. It was uncomfortable, but preferable to what had come before. I began to hope that perhaps my message had prompted reflection, that maybe she would seek the professional help she so clearly needed. During this period of silence, I found myself replaying our interactions over the years, examining them from my more mature 20-year-old perspective. I recognized the gradual erosion of boundaries that had seemed individually innocuous but collectively sinister. How a comment about similar laughter had evolved into explicit statements about replacement. How my compassionate participation had perhaps enabled her avoidance of proper grief work. I wondered about her other daughter, the younger one who had been hospitalized. What was it like to live in the shadow of not just your dead sister, but also your mother's obsession with finding her replacement? Did she feel invisible, or was she grateful to escape the weight of her mother's projections? I hoped someone was looking out for her interests, protecting her privacy in ways her mother seemed incapable of doing. These thoughts occupied me through the winter months, as I focused on my studies remotely and prepared for the next semester. The silence next door seemed like its own kind of progress, a necessary if painful step toward everyone's healing. Yesterday proved how wrong I was. I was leaving my house with a friend, both of us chatting about the movie we were planning to see, keys jingling in my hand. The day was pleasantly warm, spring finally asserting itself after a long winter. For a moment, it felt like any normal afternoon. Just two friends heading out for a casual outing, no weight of inappropriate expectations or unwanted comparisons. A movement caught my eye. My neighbor, standing in her driveway, staring directly at me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. The months of silence had lulled me into a false sense of security, making this sudden attention jarring. Her posture was rigid, her expression unreadable from a distance. And then, with deliberate slowness, she raised her middle finger in my direction, holding it there until she was certain I had seen it. The childish gesture was so unexpected that for a moment I wondered if I'd misinterpreted it. Perhaps it wasn't directed at me at all. But her unwavering stare left no room for doubt. This was intentional, a calculated public display of hostility. My friend noticed too. "What's her problem?" she whispered as we quickened our pace to my car. "It's complicated," I murmured, fumbling with my keys, suddenly anxious to be away from there. As we pulled out of the driveway, I could feel her eyes following us, that middle finger still raised like a flag of defiance. During the drive, I gave my friend a brief, sanitized version of the story. Neighbor lost her daughter. Got too attached to me. Boundaries were established. Things got awkward. I left out the more disturbing details, the replacement kid comment, the graphic photo, the years of increasingly inappropriate behavior. Even in their absence, the story sounded bizarre and uncomfortable. "That's really messed up," my friend said, shaking her head. Some people just can't handle their grief in healthy ways. I feel bad for her, I admitted, surprising myself with the truth of it despite everything. But I couldn't keep being her emotional support animal. Of course not. My friend agreed. You did the right thing setting boundaries. We tried to enjoy the movie, but my mind kept returning to that middle finger, that stare. What had precipitated this break in the months-long silence? Had something happened to trigger her anger, or had it simply been building all this time, looking for an outlet? I found myself checking my phone periodically, half expecting angry messages that never came. The drive home was tense, my anxiety building with each mile closer to my neighborhood. Part of me hoped she would have retreated inside, the moment of public hostility having satisfied whatever emotional need had prompted it. Another part of me predicted an escalation, though I couldn't have imagined the form it would take. When we returned hours later, the street was quiet, bathed in the golden light of early evening. For a moment, I thought we might make it inside without incident. Then, as we exited the car, her voice carried clearly across the space between our houses. "Douchebag!" she shouted, each syllable precisely enunciated to ensure I wouldn't miss the insult. The word echoed in the quiet street, so incongruous with the suburban setting that it might have been comical under different circumstances. But it was what followed that revealed the depth of her unprocessed grief and rage. "You would never be like her. You could never be like her. She was better than you in every way." Each sentence was hurled like a stone, designed to wound. And they did, though not in the way she likely intended. They hurt because they confirmed what I had suspected all along, that I had never been seen for myself, that I had only ever been a poor substitute, a placeholder for someone who could never return. She was kind. She was loving. Not selfish like you. Her voice broke on the last word, raw emotion finally overwhelming righteous anger. In that moment, I glimpsed the true depth of her pain, still as fresh and overwhelming as it must have been 4 years ago. Her grief hadn't progressed. It had stagnated, crystallized around the idea that her daughter could somehow be replaced, and now that illusion had been shattered as well. My friend was stunned into silence, her eyes wide as we hurried into my house. Once inside, with the door firmly locked behind us, she turned to me with a mixture of shock and concern. "Should you call someone?" she asked. "The police?" That seemed like harassment. I considered it briefly. Was this harassment? Technically, yes. The deliberate middle finger, the shouted insults, the public attempt to humiliate me. These would likely qualify in legal terms. Would involving authorities help this situation? I doubted it. What would I say? My neighbor is grieving inappropriately, and yelled at me after I refused to be her emotional support animal. How would that help a woman who was clearly still drowning in loss? And yet, a small voice inside wondered if I was still making excuses for someone who had long ago crossed every reasonable boundary. "I don't think getting the police involved would help," I said finally. "It would probably just escalate things." "What if she does something worse?" my friend pressed, concern evident in her voice. "What if she starts showing up at your door or something?" It was a valid question. Where does one draw the line? When does compassion for someone else's pain become self-endangerment? "If it gets worse, I'll definitely call someone," I promised. "But right now, I think she's just lashing out because she's hurting." My friend looked skeptical but didn't push further. We spent the rest of the evening inside, periodically peeking through the blinds like paranoid teenagers, half expecting another outburst that never came. Eventually, her husband's car pulled into their driveway, and the house next door went quiet. As I drove my friend home later that night, she asked the question I'd been asking myself for years. "Why you? I mean, I know you said you look a little like her daughter, but still. There must be lots of young women in the area." I considered this as the streetlights cast intermittent shadows across the dashboard. Proximity, maybe. I was an easy target, right next door. Knew their family, felt obligated to be nice. I paused, then added the thought that had been forming in my mind throughout the evening. And I let it happen. For a long time. I didn't know how to say no to grief. Now I sit in my childhood bedroom, typing this into the void of the internet, seeking validation or clarity, or perhaps just release. 4 years of increasingly inappropriate boundary violations, culminating in a middle finger and a shouted insult. It sounds almost comical when reduced to those terms, but living it has been anything but funny. I feel guilt still. That's the most frustrating part. I know intellectually that I've done nothing wrong, that establishing boundaries is healthy and necessary, that I am not responsible for managing another adult's grief, that no one should be asked to serve as a replacement for the dead. Yet emotionally, I questioned myself. Could I have been kinder? More patient? More understanding? Should I have spoken up sooner before her attachment to me grew so distorted? Or would that have only accelerated the inevitable confrontation? The hardest truth to accept is that her pain is real. Behind the inappropriate behavior and boundary violations is a mother whose child was ripped away too soon. I can acknowledge that while still protecting myself. Compassion doesn't require self-sacrifice. My parents will be home next week. I haven't told them about yesterday's confrontation yet, though they've witnessed the slow evolution of this uncomfortable dynamic over the years. They've given me space to handle it, trusting my judgment, though I've seen the concern in their eyes. I know they'll support whatever decision I make going forward, whether that means filing a report or simply continuing to maintain my distance. But beneath the guilt and confusion lies something stronger, a certainty that I did what was necessary. Not just for myself, but ultimately for her too. Because what kind of healing can come from pretending one person can substitute for another? What kind of peace can be found in forcing the living to wear the identity of the dead like an ill-fitting costume? Her daughter, the real one, not the idealized version that's been projected onto me, deserves to be remembered for who she actually was. And I deserve to exist as myself, not as someone's replacement kid. I don't know what happens next. I'll be returning to college in a few weeks, which will create the physical distance I now realize is essential. When I come home for holidays, I'll likely continue my practice of careful avoidance. Perhaps in time she'll seek the professional help she needs to properly process her loss. Perhaps not. What I do know is that I can't be responsible for her healing. I can feel compassion for her pain without becoming its vessel. I can acknowledge the tragedy without allowing it to define our relationship or my identity. And most importantly, I can honor the memory of the girl who died by refusing to pretend anyone, especially not me, could ever take her place. Because the truth is, no one is replaceable. Not her daughter. And not me.